Deep within the untamed heart of Russia's wilderness, isolation is more than just a feeling. It's a force of nature. The endless sprawl of dense pine forests and snow-draped birch trees stretch for miles, untouched and unmarked by human hands. For most, it's a place of rugged beauty, a retreat from the chaos of the modern world. But for some, it's a place where reality blurs. Folklore speaks of spirits, ancient curses, and beings that were never meant to be seen. But not all stories stay in the realm of myth. Here are 3 unsettling encounters from the depths of Russia's forgotten forests. Stories that may leave you questioning what's watching from the shadows. On a cold, moonless night deep in the heart of Siberia, a small group of adventurers gathered around the crackling warmth of a campfire. The forest loomed around them, its shadows seeming to dance to the rhythm of the wind. Among the group was Anastasia, a historian with an insatiable curiosity about Russian folklore, Sergei, a rugged survivalist, and Ivan, a skeptic who insisted on finding logical explanations for every tale. They had set out to investigate one of the most mysterious and eerie legends of their homeland, the tale of Baba Yaga and the whispers of the Dyatlov Pass. Their journey began weeks ago, when Anastasia stumbled upon a forgotten manuscript in a dusty archive. It spoke of an encounter in the Ural Mountains, not far from where the infamous Dyatlov Pass incident occurred. Unlike the official accounts of the hikers who mysteriously perished in 1959, this text hinted at a connection to something older and darker, Baba Yaga. The manuscript described a hut deep in the woods, perched precariously on chicken legs, and warned of a malevolent presence that would punish trespassers. "It's just a story to scare children," Ivan had scoffed as they planned their expedition. "Maybe," Anastasia had replied, "but don't you think it's worth investigating? What if there's a kernel of truth in these tales?" Now, as the firelight flickered against their faces, the air around them grew colder, almost unnaturally so. Sergei, ever attuned to the environment, frowned. "A storm is coming," he muttered. "We should find shelter." Anastasia pulled out a map and pointed to a marked location. "There's an abandoned cabin nearby. We can take refuge there." The group packed up and trudged through the snow, the forest seeming to close in tighter with each step. As they walked, Anastasia recounted the story of Baba Yaga, the witch who lived in a magical hut that could move on chicken legs. According to legend, she would test those who came to her for help, offering rewards to the pure of heart and meting out punishment to the deceitful. "What does this have to do with the Dyatlov Pass?" Ivan asked, brushing snow off his jacket. "Some say she's tied to the strange occurrences in the area," Anastasia replied. "Disappearing hikers, eerie lights, inexplicable deaths." The manuscript suggested that her domain stretches far beyond the myths. They reached the cabin just as the first flakes of snow began to fall. It was a dilapidated structure, its roof sagging and windows boarded up. Yet it was better than braving the storm. Sergei forced the door open, and they stepped inside. The interior was sparse, with broken furniture and a lingering smell of decay. A single candle sat on a dusty table, and Anastasia's eyes lit up when she noticed strange carvings on the walls. "These symbols," she whispered, tracing her fingers over the etched lines. "They match the ones described in the manuscript. This might have been a waypoint for travelers seeking Baba Yaga. Or a hideout for lunatics," Ivan muttered. They settled in for the night, but sleep came uneasily. The wind howled like a chorus of wailing souls, and shadows seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally across the walls. Anastasia dreamt of a woman with hollow eyes and hair like tangled roots, beckoning her into the forest. When she awoke, her heart pounding, She found the others already awake and on edge. "I heard something outside," Sergei said, gripping his rifle tightly. "It's just the wind," Ivan insisted, though his voice betrayed his unease. A loud knock echoed through the cabin, freezing them in place. Sergei motioned for silence and crept toward the door. When he opened it, there was nothing but swirling snow and darkness. Yet the knocking continued, louder now, coming from the walls themselves. Then a low, guttural laugh filled the air, sending chills down their spines. "We need to leave," Sergei said firmly, grabbing his pack. Anastasia protested. "No, this is what we came to find. We can't turn back now." The knocking ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. And then, from the darkness beyond the doorway, they saw it. A faint, flickering light, as if a lantern were being carried through the trees. "Follow it," Anastasia whispered, entranced. "Are you crazy?" Ivan hissed. "That's how people end up dead in these stories." But Anastasia was already stepping outside, drawn by the light. Sergei cursed under his breath and followed, with Ivan reluctantly trailing behind. The snowstorm seemed to part for them as they moved deeper into the forest, the light always just out of reach. They came to a clearing, and there it stood, a crooked hut perched atop spindly chicken legs. It shifted and turned as if alive, its windows glowing with an unnatural light. "It's real," Anastasia breathed, awe and terror mingling in her voice. The door of the hut creaked open, revealing a dark interior. Against all logic, Anastasia stepped forward, compelled by a force she couldn't explain. Sergei grabbed her arm. "Don't." "I have to," she replied, her voice distant. Before Sergei could stop her, Anastasia entered the hut, the door slamming shut behind her. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, and the walls seemed to pulse like a living organism. At a wooden table sat a figure cloaked in shadow, her bony hands stirring a cauldron. "Welcome, child," the figure rasped. "You seek knowledge, yes?" Anastasia nodded, her voice caught in her throat. "But knowledge comes at a price," the witch continued, her hollow eyes glinting in the dim light. "Are you willing to pay it?" Meanwhile, outside, Sergei and Ivan circled the hut, shouting Anastasia's name. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and the hut rose higher on its legs, turning its glowing eyes toward them. "Run!" Sergei yelled, dragging Ivan away as the hut's massive legs stomped after them. Inside, Baba Yaga leaned closer to Anastasia. "You have a choice," she whispered. "Stay and learn the truth of the forest, or leave and forget you ever saw me." Anastasia hesitated, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. But before she could answer, the door burst open, and Sergei stormed in, his rifle aimed at the witch. "Let her go," he demanded. Baba Yaga cackled, her form shifting into something monstrous, her limbs elongating and her mouth splitting into a grotesque grin. The walls of the hut began to close in, and Sergei fired a shot, the sound deafening in the confined space. The witch shrieked and vanished in a swirl of black smoke, leaving the hut to collapse around them. The three of them stumbled out into the snow, the hut's remains crumbling into ash behind them. The storm had cleared, and the forest was silent once more. As they made their way back to civilization, none of them spoke of what they had seen. Anastasia clutched the manuscript tightly, her mind racing with questions and regrets. Sergei's stoic expression betrayed a lingering fear, and even Ivan seemed shaken, his skepticism fractured. Weeks later, Anastasia returned to the archive where she had found the manuscript, only to discover that it had vanished. In its place was a single note, scrawled in a spidery hand. "Knowledge comes at a price. Be careful what you seek." My name is Artem Ivanovich Sokolov, and I'm a 27-year-old journalist from St. Petersburg. I've covered protests, corruption scandals, and even the underworld of the black market, but nothing could have prepared me for what's happening now. It started 3 days ago. My editor, Mikhail Petrovich, called me into his office, chewing on that old wooden pipe of his, like always. He'd received a tip about a series of mysterious disappearances in a small village deep in the Arkhangelsk Oblast. The village's name is Lesnoye, a speck on the map surrounded by endless ancient forest. They're calling it the Black Veil Curse, he said, smirking like it was some tabloid nonsense. Go see what's really going on. Locals love their ghost stories. I'd seen enough local ghost stories to know they're usually just that, stories. But I'm a sucker for remote places, the kind where the fog hangs low over the ground and everything smells like damp pine. So I packed my recorder, my old Nikon camera, and my notebook, and I boarded the night train to Arkhangelsk. By the time I reached Lesnoye, the weather had shifted. Heavy clouds hung like wet wool in the sky, and the cold seeped into my bones. I'm used to Russian winters, but this was something different. The cold felt hungry. The village itself was as lifeless as the fog that blanketed it. Gray, weather-beaten cottages lined a single muddy road. A few villagers glanced at me from behind frost-covered windows, but quickly pulled their curtains shut. No one waved, no one smiled. I'd booked a room with a woman named Ekaterina Sergeyevna, a gaunt old widow who barely spoke. Her hands trembled as she handed me the key, her eyes darting to the window behind me, as if she expected to see something lurking there. "Don't go walking after sunset," she said, her voice thin and brittle like the cracking of ice. I've heard old superstitions like that before, so I nodded and thanked her, though I could see she didn't believe I'd listen. That night, I heard it for the first time. A sound, faint but distinct, drifting in through the fog. It wasn't wolves. I'd know that sound anywhere. No, this was a low, uneven humming. It came and went in pulses, rising, falling, then vanishing entirely, like a voice carried on the wind. I'd never heard anything like it before. I'd like to say I stayed calm, but I'd be lying. I'm a journalist, not a soldier. I shut the window, pulled the curtain, and sat on my bed, heart pounding in my chest. I'm ashamed to admit I slept with the light on that night. The next morning I interviewed a few villagers. They're a tough, quiet people, like many from these old forest towns. But there's a difference between stoic and afraid. These people were afraid. I'd ask about the disappearances, and they'd mutter something about the veil or the song of the woods. One man, Oleg, a logger with hands like tree roots, told me about his brother Mitya. Gone 6 days now, he said, eyes fixed on the ground. I heard him calling from the woods that night. Thought he'd gotten drunk and wandered off, but he shook his head, his lips pressed into a grim line. He's gone, and I'm not going in there to look for him. That afternoon, I decided to investigate the woods myself. I've spent enough time in forests to know how to keep my bearings, mark trees, keep the sun's position in mind, basic stuff. But Lesnoye's forest, it's not like other forests. The trees are too close together, their bark blackened as if by fire. The air feels wrong, thick with the smell of wet soil and something else, something sharp and metallic, like old blood. I followed the trail where Mitya had last been seen, snapping pictures as I went, documenting everything. Then I heard it again, the humming. This time, it wasn't distant. It was close, too close. I stopped, straining my ears to catch it. It wasn't a song, not exactly. It had a rhythm, but no melody, like a lullaby sung by someone who'd never heard a song before. It echoed through the trees, every rise and fall of the sound making the hair on my arms stand up. I'd like to say I'm brave, but at that moment, all I could think was run. I'd seen enough horror movies to know that's usually the smart move. But then from somewhere to my left, I heard a voice, a human voice. Artem. My heart nearly stopped. I'd told no one I was coming into the woods, not even Ekaterina. I'm certain of it. The voice called again, just a whisper now. Artem, come here. It was soft, sweet, familiar. My mother's voice. It's impossible. My mother's in St. Petersburg. But in that moment, the logic of it didn't matter. My feet moved before I even realized it. I'm ashamed to say it. But I called back. Mama? The humming stopped. The silence hit me like a blow to the chest. I'd never felt a silence so absolute. It was like the world itself had stopped breathing. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, every nerve in my body screaming. No one is there, no one is there. But something was watching me. I could feel it, that primal, gut-deep feeling you get when you're being hunted. I'd had enough. I'm not a hero. I'm a man who's seen too many things people shouldn't see. I bolted, running back toward the village, feet crunching over dead leaves and twigs. I didn't stop until I saw the smoke curling from Ekaterina's chimney. That night I stayed inside. I'm not ashamed to say I pushed a chair against the door and kept a kitchen knife by my bed. I'd planned to leave in the morning, to take the earliest train back to Arkhangelsk. But the humming came again, louder this time, closer. It's midnight now, and I'm writing this by the dim glow of a single bulb. The humming's right outside. It's under my window. It's not alone this time. I hear footsteps, soft and wet like bare feet on cold soil. They're circling the house. I hear them tapping on the walls. I'm not going to the window. I'm not opening the curtain. I'm sorry, Mama. I'm so sorry. They call her the Rusalka of Lake Nadezhda, and I'm beginning to think the old tales were warnings, not just stories. My name is Ivan Petrovich Volkov, and I'm a 28-year-old forestry worker from Petrozavodsk. I've lived in the north my whole life. The forests here are endless and quiet, broken only by the call of crows and the soft crunch of snow underfoot. I've always felt at peace in the woods, until now. It started when I took a seasonal job at a lumber camp near Lake Nadezhda, about 40 kilometers from the nearest village. The pay was good, and I've never minded isolation. My grandfather used to tell me stories about the lake, how it was cursed, how a girl drowned there long ago and never found peace. But I'd heard those kinds of stories before. People make up tales to explain things they're afraid of. I'm not afraid of the woods. I'm not sure what day it started. Out there, the days blur together. But I remember hearing it for the first time while chopping wood by the shore. A song, soft, distant, carried on the cold wind like a lullaby hummed by a mother to a baby. I glanced toward the lake, but there was no one there. Just still water, frozen at the edges, mist curling off the surface like breath in the winter air. It's probably nothing, I thought, just the wind. But it came again, clearer, closer. A woman's voice, low and sweet. It made me stop mid-swing, the axe hanging in the air. I'd never heard anything like it before. The melody wasn't happy or sad. It was lonely. That's the only way I can describe it. Like someone calling out for something they'd lost long ago. Hello, I called, scanning the shoreline. No answer. The song faded into the wind. I told the others at dinner that night. There were 5 of us at the camp, all seasoned workers. They'd seen bears, wolves, even wolverines. But when I mentioned the singing, the mood shifted. Mikhail, the oldest of us, put down his spoon and wiped his mouth with a rag. "Don't listen to it," he said quietly, eyes fixed on the fire. "Don't answer. Don't look for her. The Rusalka sings for the lonely. If you listen too long, she'll pull you under." The others laughed, but Mikhail didn't. He just shook his head, muttering something about fools and old warnings. The next day, I stayed away from the lake. But it didn't matter. I heard her again, closer this time. The song floated between the pines, curling around the trunks like smoke. It followed me, weaving in and out of my thoughts no matter how far I went from the water. That night, I dreamed of her. She stood on the shore, half submerged in water up to her knees. Her skin was pale, almost blue, and her long black hair clung to her back like wet ropes. She was facing away from me, but I knew she knew I was there. Slowly, she tilted her head, just a little, as if listening. The same song drifted from her lips, soft and sweet. I woke up with my heart pounding, sweat freezing to my skin. By the third day, I started seeing her. It was just glimpses at first. A figure at the edge of my vision gone when I turned my head. A pale face among the reeds, black hair swaying under the surface of the water. Once, I caught sight of her reflection in the window of the cabin. She was behind me, just for a second, before she vanished. I didn't tell the others this time. I knew they'd laugh, and I'd already seen the way Mikhail looked at me, like I'd been marked. On the 5th day, Alexei went missing. We'd been working at the south edge of the camp, clearing undergrowth. He'd been ahead of me, talking about the new hunting rifle he'd bought. I'd stopped to tie my boot, and when I looked up, he was gone. No tracks, no sound, just gone. We spent hours looking for him, calling his name, searching the woods and the shore of the lake. I'll never forget Mikhail's face when he saw the footprints leading into the water. He didn't say a word, just stared at them for a long, long time. "We're leaving," he said, his voice flat and hollow. "We're leaving tomorrow." But I didn't want to leave. Not yet. That night I heard the song again, but this time it was different. It was closer, clearer, right outside my window. I'd never heard it so close before. My breath caught in my chest as I sat up in my bunk. The moonlight spilled through the cracks in the wooden shutters, and for the first time, I saw her clearly. She stood just beyond the glass, her face inches from the window. Her eyes were wrong, wide, too wide, with pupils like ink bleeding into paper. Her lips didn't move, but I could hear the song coming from her. Her eyes met mine, and everything inside me screamed to run, but I couldn't move. My body felt like stone, heavy and useless. Her hand pressed against the window, fingers long and thin, tipped with broken, jagged nails. Her head tilted, her wet hair sliding off her shoulder. The melody shifted, growing softer, sadder. Her gaze never wavered from mine. "Come," she whispered, though her lips didn't move. I woke up outside. The cold stung my bare feet, and the ground was wet with frost. I'd walked nearly to the edge of the lake before I came to my senses. The sun was rising behind me, and the first light hit the water's surface, turning it to gold. I looked down at my feet. My tracks in the snow led straight from the cabin door to where I stood, straight to her. She was in the water, just below the surface, her pale face tilted up toward me. Her eyes were open, unblinking. Her smile was so wide, it cut her face in half. She'd been waiting. I ran back to the cabin and didn't leave until Mikhail banged on the door, telling me it was time to go. I didn't argue. We packed up everything and left that morning. I didn't tell them what I'd seen. I'm not sure they would have believed me. That was 3 weeks ago. I'm back home now, safe, warm. But sometimes, at night, I still hear it. A soft song drifting through the cracks in my window, like it's calling me back. I'm trying not to listen, but it's getting harder.